Welcome back to the channel. It began in a city known for its steel, smoke, and survival. Cleveland, Ohio, the mid-1930s. America was still limping through the Great Depression. Factories slowed, breadlines stretched around corners, and the nights were long for those who had nowhere to go. Down by the rail tracks and muddy ravines of Kingsbury Run, the forgotten gathered, men who'd lost jobs, women escaping broken homes, drifters chasing rumors of work. No one expected that in this rough pocket of the city, something far darker than poverty was waiting. Between 1935 and 1938, Cleveland became the stage for a string of killings so grim that even hardened detectives hesitated to describe them. The newspapers would later call it the Torso Murders. The press gave the faceless killer a name fit for nightmares, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. His victims were not the wealthy or powerful. They were the invisible. The people society did not record, did not protect, and, too often, did not miss. Bodies began appearing in ravines, under bridges, and near freight yards dismembered, stripped of identity. Police searched for patterns, for a reason, for anyone who could connect the pieces, literally and figuratively. But every discovery only deepened the confusion. How could someone operate so boldly in the heart of a major city, leaving behind scenes so deliberate and clean? Cleveland's mood shifted from curiosity to fear. Patrolmen whispered of the butcher, as if he were a ghost haunting the industrial fog. Reporters crowded morgues. Residents locked their doors, even in neighborhoods that had never done so before. The city safety director, Eliot Ness, once famed for taking down Al Capone, was drawn into the case. His reputation gave people hope, but even he would find the hunt maddening. The butcher did not just kill. He humiliated the system meant to catch him. The city's politics turned toxic, investigations clashed, and evidence vanished in the bureaucratic storm. By 1938, the killings seemed to stop as suddenly as they began, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a trail of nameless dead. Almost a century later, Cleveland still carries the scar. Historians and investigators continue to unearth fragments, both physical and emotional, of that chapter. And while the world has changed, the shadows of Kingsbury Run remain, whispering the same old question: who was the Mad Butcher, and why did he choose them? Tonight, we return to those dark tracks, not for shock, but for understanding, to listen, piece by piece, to one of America's oldest unsolved stories. The man the papers called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was more than a local rumor. He was a reminder of how fragile safety can be when a city looks away. Between 1935 and 1938, his name became shorthand for dread in Cleveland's underbelly. Unlike the cinematic villains of later decades, this killer did not crave attention or spectacle. His crimes were quiet, methodical, and targeted at those who had already fallen through society's cracks. Most of his victims lived in the forgotten corners of the city, the hobo jungles near the railroad lines, the crowded flophouses where men paid a few cents for a cot, and the open lots where campfires flickered against the industrial haze. To many, Kingsbury Run was not a place, it was a warning. Yet, for the homeless, it was one of the few places left to exist without being pushed out. That is what made the butcher's choice of hunting ground so cruel. He struck among people who were barely seen alive, and even less remembered in death. The first known victim was discovered in 1935, a man's lower body found washed up near the Euclid Beach area, cleanly severed at the waist. A few months later, another set of remains surfaced: a woman, headless and stripped of fingerprints. As the months passed, the pattern grew unmistakable. The victims were often decapitated and dismembered with surgical precision, suggesting the killer had some anatomical knowledge or access to tools beyond a layman's reach. Each new discovery drew more police, more reporters, and more panic, but no closer sense of who or what they were chasing. The killer's choice of victims also made identification nearly impossible. Many of the dead had no family nearby, no employment records, and no clear address. In the chaos of the Great Depression, it was not uncommon for someone to vanish without a trace. That anonymity worked perfectly in the butcher's favor. The victims became numbers, not names, fragments of bodies cataloged in morgue reports, while the city quietly moved on. It is tempting to imagine the killer as some phantom genius, but perhaps what made him most effective was how invisible his prey already were. No one noticed when they disappeared. No one knew when they last ate or where they slept. By the time someone did care, it was because police were retrieving what was left of them from the mud. In this story, the villain is chilling not only because of what he did, but because of where he did it, in plain sight of a city too distracted, too broken to see him coming. The pattern of violence was as distinct as it was horrifying. Every discovery followed a grim rhythm: torsos without heads, limbs missing, flesh expertly cut rather than torn. The butcher did not leave chaos. He left precision. Investigators noted that the clean separations suggested someone who understood anatomy, possibly a butcher, surgeon, or even a medical worker. Whoever it was, the killer treated the human body like a puzzle, a set of parts to be rearranged, hidden, or displayed. One of the first victims found in Kingsbury Run had been neatly decapitated, the head missing entirely. Later victims showed similar signs: bones cut smoothly, no hesitation marks, no signs of struggle where the blade met skin. The city's medical examiner, Dr. Gerber, remarked that the killer seemed to work with calm confidence. This was not improvisation. It was method. The press could not resist the gruesome details. Headlines screamed about the torso murderer, the butcher of Kingsbury Run, and Cleveland's human puzzle. Photographs of police standing by Headless remains filled newspapers, sometimes without warning. For a city already worn down by poverty, the images were like salt in a wound, proof that danger did not just belong to gangsters or back alleys, but could rise from the mud beside the rail yards. There was a cold theatricality to the way the bodies were found. Some were dumped in plain view, others half hidden near freight lines, as if the killer wanted to remind the city of his reach. Even worse, the remains were often stripped clean of fingerprints, making identification almost impossible. The precision was so deliberate that police began to suspect the murders were more than random, perhaps ritualistic, or at least designed to send a message no one could quite read. But beyond the gore and mystery, what struck investigators most was the absence of chaos. No signs of panic, no defensive wounds suggesting a fight. Many believed the victims were either drugged or unconscious before death, perhaps even dead before being dismembered. That detail chilled the city more than anything, the idea that the butcher did not just kill people, he erased them. By 1936, Cleveland's morgue was crowded with nameless torsos, tagged and numbered, waiting for recognition that would never come. The police built maps of the dump sites, hoping for a pattern. But every time they thought they found one, the next body appeared somewhere new. It was as if the killer was listening and laughing quietly in the dark. In Cleveland's forgotten corridors, life was already precarious before the killings began. The rail yards and ravines of Kingsbury Run drew the poor, the jobless, and the restless people chasing rumors of work or simply surviving another night. Makeshift camps sprang up under bridges, built from scrap wood and rusted tin. Smoke from campfires curled through the damp air as trains rumbled overhead, carrying goods and dreams that never stopped for the ones below. These were the people the butcher preyed on, the invisible citizens of the Depression. Most had no identification, no steady work, and no one waiting for them at home. When they vanished, no alarm was raised. When their remains surfaced, few could say who they would been. Detectives sometimes gave them nicknames: Tattooed Man, Lady of the Lake, John Doe No, for as if to fill the silence their absence left behind. Investigators soon realized that almost all the victims came from this same pocket of the city. Some had been seen drinking near the shanty towns or sleeping along the rail lines. Others were believed to have come through the area only briefly, just passing through. The pattern told a quiet truth. The butcher chose people who could disappear without consequence. It was not just brutality, it was calculation. For Cleveland's upper class, the horror felt distant, almost unreal. The victims were outsiders to them, ghosts that drifted through another world. But for the police patrolling the run, the killings exposed how deep the city's neglect ran. Each body forced them to confront not only the violence of one person, but the collective indifference of thousands. As the number of victims grew, morgue walls filled with photographs, headless torsos labeled by date and location, each one a life reduced to evidence. Detectives pinned notes and maps, hoping to trace a line that would lead to the killer. But in the noise of poverty and the endless churn of new arrivals, the butcher moved unseen. In the end, the case was not just about what was done to those people, but about what had already been done to them by a world that stopped caring long before they died. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city stretched thin. The Great Depression had gutted its industry and pride, leaving thousands without work. Entire families lived on charity bread, and the police department, underfunded, overworked, was fighting to keep basic order. In that climate, the torso murders did not just happen in chaos. They were born from it. Detectives trying to identify the victims faced impossible odds. Record keeping was poor. Many people traveled under false names or none at all. Hospitals, shelters, and missions overflowed with strangers no one could trace. Each body recovered from Kingsbury Run became another impossible riddle. Who were they before this? Who, if anyone, was looking for them? The lack of resources made the investigation crawl. Forensic science was still young. No DNA, no fingerprint databases, no computer tracking. Even photography was limited. Investigators relied on sketches, newspaper appeals, and the faint hope that someone might recognize a tattoo or a scar. More often than not, no one did. Meanwhile, public fear grew, fueled by rumor and despair. Every dismembered body was a reminder that even in a city fighting to survive, something even darker was prowling the edges. Reporters played on the panic. Politicians promised order. And ordinary people wondered whether the butcher was a stranger or someone they passed every day on the streetcar. In a sense, the Great Depression became the butcher's best disguise. In a city already fractured by hunger and hopelessness, one more missing person barely registered. The killer did not just exploit individuals. He exploited an era. And that may be why, nearly a century later, the mystery still lingers, because the city itself was too wounded to stop him. By the time investigators finally connected the dots, the scale of the killings was staggering. 12 victims were formally linked to the same killer, but unofficially, whispers placed the count closer to 20. Some bodies were never found whole, only fragments discovered months apart. Others were so decomposed or incomplete that investigators could not even say for certain if they belonged to one person or two. Each discovery added a new layer of dread. Police tried to piece the puzzle together, marking dump sites on a large map: the Cuyahoga River, Kingsbury Run, Big Creek, and Lake Erie's edges. The pattern suggested that the killer knew the terrain well, possibly someone who moved easily through the city's industrial backroads or rail lines. The victims themselves varied in age and gender, though most were adults in their 20s to 40s. 2 were women, the rest men. Some had traces of alcohol or sedatives in their system, suggesting the killer might have incapacitated them before death. That detail only deepened the mystery. Whoever this person was, they had both access and control of tools, time, and perhaps transportation. As the count rose, public confidence in law enforcement began to crumble. Each new body exposed not just another crime, but another failure to stop the next one. Detectives worked day and night, yet every lead dissolved into rumor. Forensic evidence was limited to knife angles, clothing remnants, and vague eyewitness accounts of a tall man with a hat. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, became almost a reluctant archivist of horror, cataloging torsos, sketching missing heads, comparing saw marks under dim morgue lights. In his reports, he refused to assign emotion, but in private, he admitted the scale of the case was beyond what the city could process. By 1938, the official number froze at 12 known victims, 12 open wounds on the map of Cleveland. But investigators knew the truth was bigger, blurred at the edges. The butcher's reach likely extended past what anyone could prove, and the city quietly stopped counting what it could not solve. When the killings began to dominate headlines, Cleveland's leaders turned to one man who symbolized law and order: Eliot Ness, the famed prohibition agent who had helped bring down Al Capone. By 1935, Ness had traded Chicago's gang wars for the quieter title of safety director in Cleveland, overseeing both the police and fire departments. The Torso murders would soon test that reputation to its breaking point. At first, Ness handled the case with his usual discipline. He reorganized the homicide squad, brought in fresh investigators, and demanded a scientific approach: autopsy photos, forensic sketches, precise maps. The public had faith that the untouchable could end the nightmare that ordinary officers could not. But the butcher never played by the rules. Every time Ness's team followed a lead, the killer seemed to vanish into the city's shadows. Frustration built. The press mocked the lack of progress, and political rivals whispered that Ness's legendary career had peaked years earlier. Then, in 1938, he made a controversial move that still divides historians. He ordered a midnight raid on Kingsbury Run. Police swept through the shantytowns, arrested drifters, and burned the camps to the ground, an act Ness defended as a safety measure meant to flush out the killer's hiding place. It did not work. No new bodies appeared for a while, but there was also no proof the raid stopped anything. To many citizens, it looked less like victory and more like desperation, punishing the poor instead of finding the murderer. Behind closed doors, Ness continued to chase one suspect in particular, a troubled physician named Francis Sweeney, whose mental instability and surgical background fit the profile. Ness even arranged for secret interrogations, but without solid evidence, Sweeney was never charged. The case slipped through his hands like smoke. By the end of a decade, Ness had lost the city's confidence and his own sense of triumph. The butcher had beaten him not through violence, but through absence, by staying invisible long enough for Cleveland to give up. In the years that followed, Ness would carry the weight of that failure, a silent footnote beneath his legendary career. Among all the men questioned, Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney stood out, a World War I veteran and trained surgeon who matched nearly every unsettling detail investigators feared to admit. He had the medical skill to dismember a body cleanly, the physical access to tools, and the volatile mind shaped by years of untreated trauma. By 1938, Ness and his detectives quietly focused their attention on him, believing they might have finally found the Mad Butcher. Sweeney's background was both impressive and tragic. He had served as a medical officer in the war, where he witnessed injuries that no human should have to see, let alone repair. After returning home, his life fractured. He battled alcoholism, erratic behavior, and periods of rage. His wife eventually left him, taking their children. By the mid-30s, Sweeney had become a ghost in his own city, intelligent but unraveling. When Ness's team finally brought him in for questioning, they conducted what was described as a voluntary psychiatric interrogation. For several days, Sweeney was examined, questioned, and even subjected to early forms of lie detection. The results were damning but not admissible. The machine spiked wildly during key questions about the murders. Ness was convinced he had his man. But the law was not on his side. The evidence was circumstantial, no witnesses, no physical proof, no confession. Worse, Sweeney's political connections ran deep. His cousin was a sitting congressman who had enough influence to pressure the investigation into silence. Not long after the questioning, Sweeney voluntarily checked himself into a mental hospital, where he would spend much of his remaining life. There, his letters to Eliot Ness turned bitter and mocking. He sent cryptic notes, sometimes referring to himself as the one who got away. Whether these were the taunts of guilt or the ramblings of a damaged mind, no one could say for sure. Ness, frustrated but restrained by law, could only watch the suspect fade behind institutional walls. For decades, Sweeney remained the unproven culprit, a man who fit the story too well to ignore, yet too loosely to convict. Even after his death in 1964, debate lingered. Some said Ness protected the truth to spare the city further scandal. Others believed Sweeney was merely a convenient scapegoat, a broken man haunted by coincidence. Either way, the mystery survived because in Cleveland, justice never truly arrived. When the last known body was found in 1938, the killings seemed to stop as abruptly as they began. No arrests, no trial, no confession, just silence. Cleveland, exhausted by fear and humiliation, wanted to move on. Officially, the file stayed open, but in truth, the city folded it away, hoping time would erase the shame. For investigators, that silence was worse than any verdict. Over the decades that followed, police chiefs, journalists, and amateur sleuths revisited the evidence again and again, trying to see what the 1930s detectives had missed. Some pointed to Francis Sweeney, convinced he was the butcher. Others argued the real killer might have been a railroad worker, or even a transient himself, someone who simply moved on when the pressure grew too heavy. Yet every theory met the same wall, no proof. The case had been built on fragments, bones, rumors, partial files, degraded photographs. The city's archives suffered fires, transfers, and decades of neglect. Some records vanished completely. Even the physical evidence, stored in aging police lockers, decayed beyond use. By the 1950s, the Torso murders had drifted into legend. Cleveland grew, changed, rebuilt. The generation that had shivered through those years aged into quiet memory. Still, the story refused to die. It resurfaced in books, documentaries, and late-night radio shows, each time with a slightly different spin: the doctor, the drifter, the copycat. None could close the case, but all kept alive. The official stance never changed: unsolved. Even Eliot Ness, before his death in 1957, admitted privately that he believed he would find the killer but could not prove it. That frustration became part of his legacy, a reminder that even heroes can be defeated not by villains, but by the limits of truth itself. Today, the butcher of Kingsbury Run exists somewhere between history and myth. A real killer who lived and walked the streets of Cleveland, and a symbol of how easily justice can fail when darkness hides in plain sight. The city still carries that unanswered question like a scar, not just who did it, but why we never knew. Nearly 90 years later, the case that once haunted Cleveland's nights has stirred again. In 2024, local authorities and forensic genealogists began exhuming the remains of several unidentified victims buried in unmarked graves. Their goal was no longer to hunt the killer, but to give names back to the dead. The project was led by the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, working in partnership with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit group specializing in solving cold cases through advanced DNA techniques. Modern science had finally caught up with what 1930s investigators could only dream of. Where fingerprint dust and faded photographs had failed, genetic genealogy might now succeed. Technicians carefully removed soil and bone from the gravesites, handling each fragment with a precision that earlier investigators never had the tools for. Even the smallest trace of marrow or tissue could hold enough genetic material to map family trees. Once extracted, the DNA would be compared with vast databases of public ancestry profiles, tracing distant relatives who might not even know their connection to Kingsbury Run. The first exhumations focused on victims known by their nicknames, the Tattooed Man and John Doe No. For these were the figures who had become almost symbolic of the mystery men remembered more by how they were found than who they were. For decades, their graves carried only numbers. Now, there is a chance those numbers could become names again. It is not an easy process. Time erodes bone, moisture corrupts DNA, and the city's old burial records are scattered. But each successful extraction feels like progress, a small defiance against the anonymity the butcher forced on his victims. To the scientists and genealogists involved, this work is not about reopening wounds. It is about restoring humanity to those who were denied it. Every test, every family tree mapped, is a quiet act of remembrance, proof that even 90 years later, Cleveland has not entirely turned away from its ghosts. For the first time in generations, the story of the Torso murders is being rewritten not by journalists or detectives, but by molecules, the buried code that may finally tell who these people were, even if it never tells who killed them. The collaboration between the DNA Doe Project and the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office marks a quiet but historic turning point for this case. For decades, the story of the Cleveland Torso murders revolved around a nameless killer. Now, it is turning toward the nameless dead. Genetic genealogy works differently from traditional police work. It does not hunt for suspects. It searches for connections. By comparing DNA samples from the exhumed remains to vast online databases, genealogists trace distant relatives and build out family trees. Sometimes, a match leads to a second cousin in another state, someone who has never heard of Kingsbury Run, but whose genetic code helps identify a lost relative buried beneath it. This method has already closed hundreds of cold cases across America, but applying it to the Torso murders is especially challenging. The remains are nearly a century old, and the victims came from transient backgrounds, few records, few living relatives, and often no photographs. Every match is a fragile hope that can take months, even years, to confirm. Yet the team persists. Each successful DNA extraction and each partial family connection brings them closer to restoring identity. One investigator described it as a conversation between the living and the forgotten. These efforts do not aim to catch a killer that chance likely died long ago, but to reclaim the dignity that time and violence took away. Local historians and community groups have joined in, collecting oral histories from families who had relatives disappear during the 1930s. Some have offered DNA samples, hoping to close a chapter their grandparents whispered about but never understood. It is a slow, delicate process, but for the first time, science and compassion are working hand in hand to give the victims what they were denied in life: a name, a story, and a place in history that is their own. Each identified victim will not only rewrite part of Cleveland's darkest mystery, but also remind the city that justice is not only about punishment sometimes, it is about remembrance. Despite all the attention, no new suspect has surfaced, but that is no longer the central goal. The modern investigation is not about finding a killer who is long dead. It is about restoring the humanity of those he erased. For the first time, Cleveland's focus has shifted from chasing the shadows of a murderer to recognizing the people who were lost in them. The teams involved scientists, genealogists, historians speak not of justice, but of acknowledgement. Each identified name is treated as a small victory against oblivion. These were not nameless torsos, but individuals with stories that reached beyond Kingsbury Run: workers, travelers, parents, siblings. People who once mattered, even if history forgot them. That change in focus has brought a different kind of healing. Local residents, many with generational ties to the area, have begun to visit the old sites again, not as places of horror, but of remembrance. Some families have come forward, hoping that a missing relative from the Depression years might finally be found. Others simply leave flowers or handwritten notes at the memorials. Law enforcement officials have made it clear there is no active hunt for a living perpetrator. Too much time has passed, and most of the original evidence has decayed. But the work continues quietly, name by name, through DNA matches and ancestral tracing. In the end, the Cleveland torso murders have become less a story of crime than a meditation on memory, how a city once failed to protect its most vulnerable, and now, decades later, is trying to remember them properly. The Mad Butcher remains a ghost, but the people he silenced are, at last, beginning to speak again, not through fear, but through the steady voice of truth reclaimed. As we look back on the Cleveland torso murders, it is clear the story was never just about one killer. It was about a city on the edge, a time when fear and poverty blurred the line between victim and forgotten. The butcher vanished, but his silence left behind a question that still matters. How does a society value the lives of those it barely sees? Nearly a century later, the investigation has become an act of remembrance rather than pursuit. Each recovered name, each identified victim, pulls a life back from the void. That is the quiet victory buried beneath all the horror, the proof that even when justice fails, memory can still redeem. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of America's most haunting mysteries. If this story made you think about the lives behind the headlines, take a moment to share it, subscribe for more true crime reflections, and help keep these lost voices heard. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, some stories never end. They simply wait for someone to listen.